What started as a routine Navy charity gala at the prestigious Marina Bay Resort would end with Admiral Harrison Blackwood's 30-year career in absolute ruins, all because he made the fatal mistake of humiliating the wrong woman. Staff Sergeant Alina Moskov had walked into that glittering ballroom wearing a simple black dress, her military decorations carefully pinned to her lapel, expecting nothing more than a quiet evening supporting veteran causes. She had no idea that within 2 hours she would single-handedly expose one of the Navy's most decorated officers as a fraud, a coward, and a criminal, all while 500 of the military's elite watched in stunned silence. The confrontation began with a snide comment about women not belonging in combat, but it would escalate into something far more devastating than anyone could have predicted. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Marina Bay Resort's grand ballroom sparkled under crystal chandeliers, filled with the cream of military society. Officers in dress uniforms mingled with politicians, defense contractors, and wealthy donors, all gathered for the annual Heroes Foundation Charity Gala. The event raised millions each year for wounded veterans, and attendance was considered essential for anyone with serious military or political ambitions. Admiral Harrison Blackwood worked the room like the seasoned political operator he'd become, his chest heavy with ribbons and medals, his smile practiced and his handshake firm. At 62, Blackwood commanded respect through sheer presence, his silver hair perfectly styled, his uniform immaculate, every gesture calculated to project authority and competence. Alina Moskov entered the ballroom quietly, drawing little attention in her understated black evening dress. At 34, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove to anyone, her Eastern European features elegant and composed. The only hints of her military background were the small ribbon rack on her dress and the way she instinctively surveyed the room upon entering, a habit ingrained by years in hostile territory. She'd been invited as a representative of the Combat Veterans Association, one of many younger veterans asked to attend to show the Foundation's commitment to all generations of service members. Alina had served 3 tours in Afghanistan as an Army combat engineer, specializing in explosive ordnance disposal, but she preferred to let her work speak rather than broadcast her accomplishments. The early part of the evening proceeded predictably, with speeches from Foundation board members, updates on programs funded by previous galas, and the usual networking that accompanied such events. Alina found herself in conversations with other veterans, sharing stories and discussing the challenges of transitioning to civilian careers. She noticed Admiral Blackwood holding court near the bar, surrounded by a circle of admirers hanging on his every word as he regaled them with tales of his distinguished service. His voice carried across the room, confident and commanding, as he described various operations he'd supposedly led and the decorations he'd earned for his heroic actions. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As the evening progressed, Alina couldn't help but notice something odd about the Admiral's stories. Having spent years in military intelligence briefings and after-action reports, she had developed an ear for inconsistencies, and several details in Blackwood's anecdotes didn't align with historical facts she knew well. The dates he mentioned for certain operations were wrong, the unit designations he claimed to have served with didn't match their actual deployment schedules, and some of the medals he wore corresponded to campaigns that occurred when he would have been stationed elsewhere. Initially, she dismissed these discrepancies as the natural embellishments that often crept into war stories over time, but the pattern was becoming too consistent to ignore. The first direct interaction between Alina and Admiral Blackwood occurred at the silent auction display, where various military memorabilia and luxury items were up for bid. Alina was examining a vintage Army field manual when she overheard Blackwood talking to a group of young military wives about the realities of modern warfare. His tone was patronizing as he explained how combat had changed since his day, how the military had been forced to lower standards to accommodate political correctness, and how the integration of women into combat roles had compromised operational effectiveness. The women nodded politely, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge such a senior officer publicly. Alina felt her jaw tighten as she listened to Blackwood dismiss the sacrifices and contributions of her fellow female service members, many of whom had died or been permanently disabled in the same fights where she'd served. She thought of her friend Jessica Torres, who had lost both legs defusing an IED in Kandahar, and Lieutenant Sarah Kim, who had been killed by sniper fire while leading her platoon through Helmand Province. These women had proven their courage and competence under the worst possible conditions, and hearing their service minimized by someone who should have known better stirred something dangerous in Alina's chest. When Blackwood noticed Alina's attention, he misinterpreted her focused stare as admiration and decided to include her in his impromptu lecture. "You see, young lady," he said, gesturing toward Alina with his champagne glass, "the modern military has forgotten what real warfare looks like. When I was leading operations in the Persian Gulf, we understood that combat was a man's business, requiring a man's strength and a man's courage. These feel-good policies about gender integration have weakened our fighting force and put lives at risk." His audience shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension building in the air, but none dared to challenge his pronouncements. Alina set down her champagne glass with deliberate control, her expression neutral but her eyes beginning to flash with something dangerous. Admiral Blackwood continued his monologue, emboldened by what he mistook for Alina's respectful silence. He moved closer to her, his voice taking on a more condescending tone as he prepared to deliver what he clearly believed would be a definitive lesson about military reality. "Now, I'm sure you support our troops, and that's admirable," he said, his smile patronizing as he looked down at her. "But you have to understand that when politicians start playing social experiments with our armed forces, good soldiers die. Women simply don't have the physical capability or the mental fortitude required for real combat operations. It's not their fault, it's just biology." Several other guests had begun to drift closer, drawn by the increasingly uncomfortable atmosphere, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. The Admiral's confidence grew with his audience, and he began to gesture more dramatically, his voice rising as he warmed to his favorite subject. "I've seen it firsthand in multiple theaters of operation," he declared, puffing out his chest. "Female soldiers freeze up under fire, they can't carry the equipment loads required for extended operations, and they create unnecessary distractions for male soldiers who should be focused on the mission. The death toll from these misguided policies is something the liberal media will never report, but those of us who've served in real combat zones know the truth." His words dripped with the authority of someone who believed his rank made his opinions unquestionable, regardless of their factual basis. Alina's expression remained perfectly controlled, but those who knew her well would have recognized the subtle signs of her growing anger. Her posture straightened slightly, her hands clasped behind her back in a parade rest position that was purely instinctive, and her voice carried a deceptively calm tone when she finally spoke. "That's an interesting perspective, Admiral," she said quietly, her Eastern European accent barely detectable, but adding a subtle edge to her words. "I'm curious about your personal experience with female soldiers in combat situations. Could you share some specific examples of how women's presence compromised operations you personally led?" The question seemed innocent enough on the surface, but there was something in her delivery that made several nearby officers exchange glances, sensing undercurrents they couldn't quite identify. Blackwood's eyes lit up with the opportunity to share more of his supposed wisdom, completely missing the trap being laid for him. He launched into an elaborate story about a classified operation in Iraq, where female support personnel had allegedly caused a mission failure due to their inability to handle combat stress. According to his version of events, he had been forced to abort a crucial raid because women in his unit had panicked under fire, compromising their position and endangering the lives of male soldiers who had to protect them instead of focusing on their objectives. The story was delivered with dramatic flair, complete with detailed descriptions of the tactical situation and his own heroic efforts to salvage the mission despite the inherent handicap of having women in his command structure. As Blackwood spoke, Alina's expression grew increasingly skeptical, her trained ear picking up numerous inconsistencies in his account. The unit designations he mentioned didn't correspond to any formations that would have included both Navy personnel and Army support staff in the configuration he described. The timeline he provided didn't align with major operations conducted in that sector during the period he claimed to have served there. Most tellingly, the tactical scenario he outlined contained several fundamental errors that no experienced combat officer would make, suggesting that his knowledge of ground operations was largely theoretical rather than based on actual experience. The problem, Blackwood continued, now fully committed to his performance, is that political appointees in the Pentagon care more about appearing progressive than they do about military effectiveness. They've created a situation where pointing out these obvious truths gets you labeled as some kind of dinosaur, when what we really need is honest leadership willing to acknowledge biological realities. He gestured dismissively toward the small group of military wives who had been his original audience. These ladies understand their proper role in supporting their husband's service, but unfortunately, too many women today want to pretend they can do jobs they're simply not equipped for. The condescension in his tone was becoming increasingly blatant, and several people in the growing crowd were beginning to look uncomfortable with the direction of his comments. Alina noticed that at least 3 people were now discreetly recording the conversation with their phones, apparently recognizing that they might be witnessing something newsworthy. When the Admiral finished his latest story, he looked around the gathering with satisfaction, clearly expecting admiration for his battlefield wisdom and leadership under pressure. Instead, he found himself facing a woman whose demeanor had shifted from politely attentive to professionally skeptical. Alina's next question cut through the military social protocol like a precision blade. "Admiral, forgive me if I'm mistaken, but didn't you serve your entire career in naval intelligence and logistics coordination? When exactly did you have operational command of ground forces in Iraq?" Her tone remained respectful, but the question hung in the air like an unexploded ordnance, dangerous and impossible to ignore. The precision of her inquiry suggested knowledge rather than curiosity, and several retired officers in the crowd began paying closer attention to the exchange. The Admiral's confident smile faltered for just a moment before he recovered, his decades of political maneuvering kicking in as he attempted to deflect the challenge. "Well, of course the details of classified operations must remain confidential, but I had extensive coordination responsibilities that gave me unique insight into ground operations," he replied, his voice carrying a subtle warning that further questioning might be inappropriate. "I think we should focus on the broader principles rather than getting bogged down in operational specifics that civilians wouldn't understand anyway." The dismissive reference to civilians was clearly intended to put Alina in her place, assuming she was simply an interested citizen rather than someone with military experience. That assumption proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation. Alina's eyes hardened perceptibly, and several retired officers in the gathering began to recognize something familiar in her bearing, a certain quality that only came from extensive combat experience. "I see," she said, her voice remaining level but gaining an underlying intensity that made smart people want to start backing away from the conversation. "So your expertise on women in combat comes from coordination roles rather than direct command experience. That's helpful context for evaluating your conclusions." She paused for a moment, letting the implication sink in before continuing. "I'm curious about your assessment of specific female soldiers' performance under combat conditions, since you seem to have such definitive opinions on the subject." Admiral Blackwood sensed that the conversation was moving into dangerous territory, but his ego prevented him from backing down gracefully. Instead of recognizing the warning signs and finding a diplomatic way to change the subject, he doubled down on his position with the arrogance of someone who had never been seriously challenged in a social setting. "Look, miss," he said, his tone becoming increasingly condescending, "I've been in the military longer than you've been alive. I've seen the statistics, I've read the reports, and I've witnessed firsthand how political correctness has weakened our military effectiveness. Women may serve admirably in support roles, but pretending they can match men in combat situations is dangerous fantasy that gets people killed." The circle of onlookers had grown larger, and the conversation had reached a volume that was beginning to draw attention from across the ballroom. Several senior officers who suspected what was coming were watching with growing anticipation, recognizing that a significant confrontation was brewing. Some attempted subtle interventions, making comments about the lovely venue or suggesting that everyone might want to visit the bar, but both Alina and Admiral Blackwood were now locked in a battle of wills that neither seemed prepared to abandon. The tension in the air was palpable, with many guests sensing that they were about to witness something extraordinary. Alina took a small step forward, her movement so subtle that most observers didn't notice, but it changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Her voice remained calm and professional, but there was now an unmistakable steel beneath the surface that made Admiral Blackwood instinctively straighten his posture. "Admiral," she said, her words carrying across the increasingly quiet space around them, "I appreciate your willingness to share your perspectives on military effectiveness. Since you've made such strong claims about women's capabilities in combat, I assume you wouldn't object to having those opinions challenged by someone with relevant experience." The question was phrased politely, but everyone present could sense that it was actually a formal challenge issued with the precision of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Before Blackwood could respond, a smooth, authoritative voice cut through the tension from the edge of the gathering. "Admiral Blackwood, I don't believe you've been properly introduced." The speaker was General Patricia Morrison, a retired Marine Corps commander who served on the Foundation's board of directors. She moved through the crowd with the easy authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, her presence immediately shifting the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Morrison's arrival was like watching a master strategist enter a battlefield, her timing perfect and her intentions clearly calculated to maximum effect. "General Morrison," Blackwood acknowledged, relief evident in his voice as he assumed she was intervening to rescue him from an increasingly uncomfortable situation. "I was just explaining to this young lady how military policy decisions affect operational effectiveness." His smile was strained but hopeful, clearly expecting support from a fellow senior officer who would understand the importance of maintaining proper hierarchical respect. Instead, General Morrison's expression remained neutral as she turned to address Alina directly, her next words destined to change everything. "Staff Sergeant Moskov," Morrison said formally, using Alina's rank and name with the precision of someone reading from an official record. "I don't believe Admiral Blackwood is familiar with your service record." The use of rank immediately electrified the gathering, as many of the civilians present suddenly realized they had been witnessing a confrontation between two military professionals rather than an officer lecturing a civilian supporter. Alina came to a subtle position of attention, acknowledging the general's recognition with a crisp nod that spoke of ingrained military discipline and respect for proper command structure. Admiral Blackwood's face went through several rapid changes of expression as the implications of Morrison's introduction began to sink in. His eyes darted between the two women, trying to process how badly he might have miscalculated the situation. "Staff Sergeant," he repeated, his voice uncertain as he attempted to regain his footing in a conversation that had suddenly shifted beneath him. I didn't realize," he trailed off, clearly struggling to find a way to maintain his authority, while acknowledging that he had been arguing military policy with an actual veteran rather than a civilian guest. General Morrison's expression remained professionally neutral, but there was something in her eyes that suggested she was taking considerable satisfaction in the Admiral's discomfort. "Staff Sergeant Moskov served 3 combat tours in Afghanistan as an explosive ordnance disposal specialist with the Army Corps of Engineers," she continued, her voice carrying clearly across the hushed ballroom. "She holds the Bronze Star with Voss for Valor, 2 Purple Hearts, and the Combat Action Badge among other decorations. She's been credited with personally defusing over 400 improvised explosive devices and has been directly responsible for saving countless lives in some of the most dangerous areas of operation." The impact of Morrison's words was immediate and devastating to Blackwood's position. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as guests began to understand the full scope of what they had been witnessing. An admiral with decades of service in intelligence and logistics had been pontificating about combat effectiveness to a decorated combat veteran who had repeatedly risked her life in actual battle conditions. The irony was not lost on anyone present, and Blackwood's face began to flush as he realized how thoroughly he had humiliated himself through his own arrogance and assumptions. But Morrison wasn't finished. "Perhaps most relevantly to this conversation," she continued, her
her voice taking on a slightly sharper edge. Staff Sergeant Moskov earned her first Purple Heart when she deliberately triggered an IED with her own body to protect a squad of male soldiers who had walked into a kill zone. She spent 3 months in recovery before returning to active duty, where she continued to serve with distinction until completing her 3rd deployment. The additional details hit the gathering like a physical blow, as everyone present understood that they had just heard about an act of heroism that directly contradicted every stereotype Blackwood had been promoting. Alina remained silent during General Morrison's recitation of her service record, her expression unchanged but her eyes fixed steadily on Admiral Blackwood's increasingly uncomfortable face. The crowd had grown to include nearly a quarter of the ballroom's attendees, with phones now openly recording what everyone recognized as a historic moment. When Morrison finished speaking, Alina finally broke her silence with words that cut through the tension like a blade through silk. "Thank you for the introduction, General Morrison," she said formally, then turned back to face Blackwood directly. "Admiral, now that we've established the context for this conversation, would you like to continue sharing your thoughts on women's capability in combat situations? I'm particularly interested in your assessment of how fear and panic affect operational effectiveness, since you seem to have such definitive opinions on the subject." The question was delivered with devastating precision, designed to force Blackwood into an impossible position. He could either continue his previous arguments, knowing that everyone present now understood he was challenging the expertise of someone who had proven her courage under fire repeatedly, or he could attempt to back down, thereby admitting that his earlier statements had been uninformed prejudice rather than professional assessment. Either choice would result in significant damage to his reputation and authority, but the trap had been laid with such skill that there was no escape route that would preserve his dignity.
Rather than recognizing the graceful exit that the revelation of Alina's service record had offered him, Admiral Blackwood made the catastrophic decision to interpret the situation as a challenge to his authority, rather than an opportunity for dignified retreat. His face flushed deeper as his ego overrode whatever tactical sense his years of military service might have provided, and he chose to escalate rather than retreat from a battle he was already losing. The murmurs from the crowd had grown louder, and he could sense the shift in their sympathy, which only fueled his determination to reassert his authority and put this insubordinate young woman back in what he considered her proper place. "Now you listen to me, Sergeant," Blackwood snapped, deliberately using her rank in a tone that made it sound like an insult rather than an acknowledgement of her service. His voice rose enough that conversations throughout the ballroom began to quiet as more people turned their attention toward the confrontation. "I don't care how many medals you think you've earned, or how many bombs you claim to have defused. The fact remains that women in combat units create problems that cost lives, and no amount of politically correct posturing is going to change that reality." His finger jabbed toward her accusingly, a breach of military courtesy that caused several retired officers in the audience to stiffen with disapproval. The transformation in the crowd's demeanor was immediate and palpable. What had begun as polite interest in an unusual conversation had evolved into shocked silence as hundreds of people witnessed a senior officer publicly disrespecting a decorated combat veteran. Phones appeared throughout the gathering, with guests recognizing that they were witnessing something that would likely become national news within hours. Several board members of the foundation moved closer, their expressions showing mounting concern as they realized that their charity event was becoming the backdrop for a public relations disaster. Alina's response to Blackwood's outburst was a masterclass in military bearing under pressure. Rather than matching his aggressive tone or showing any sign of being intimidated, she actually seemed to become calmer and more composed, her posture shifting into the relaxed alertness of someone completely confident in their ability to handle whatever escalation might come. When she spoke, her voice carried the kind of quiet authority that experienced soldiers associated with officers who had proven themselves under the worst possible conditions. "Admiral," she said, her tone remaining perfectly professional while somehow managing to convey complete disdain. "I appreciate your passion for military effectiveness, even if I question the basis for your conclusions. However, since you've chosen to make this personal rather than professional, perhaps we should examine the foundation for your expertise on combat operations." She paused deliberately, allowing the tension in the room to build while her eyes never left his face. You mentioned serving in multiple theaters of operation and witnessing the effects of women in combat firsthand. Could you share some specific details about your combat experience? The question hung in the air like a challenge that everyone present understood would determine the outcome of this confrontation. Blackwood's face went through several rapid changes of color as he realized the trap he had walked into. His entire career had been built on political maneuvering and administrative competence, with his only deployments involving desk jobs at secure installations far from any actual fighting. The ribbons on his chest represented length of service, administrative achievements, and participation in campaigns where he had never been closer to combat than the climate-controlled offices where he processed reports written by people who had actually done the fighting. "My service record speaks for itself," he replied stiffly, attempting to maintain his authority through sheer force of personality. "I served with distinction in multiple theaters of operation and earned the respect of my subordinates and superiors alike. I don't need to justify my credentials to someone who clearly doesn't understand proper military courtesy or the appropriate way to address senior officers." His voice carried the outraged tone of someone who had rarely been challenged directly, and who expected his rank alone to end any discussion of his qualifications or experience. But Alina was far from finished with her systematic dismantling of his position. "With respect, Admiral," she continued, her words precise and measured, "military courtesy typically involves accuracy in one's claims about service and respect for fellow veterans, regardless of rank or gender. Since you've made definitive statements about women's performance under fire, I'm simply asking for the combat experience that qualifies you to make such assessments. Surely someone with your strong opinions must have extensive first-hand knowledge of combat operations." General Morrison stepped forward slightly, her expression now showing clear disapproval of the Admiral's behavior. "Admiral," she said formally, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had actually led troops in combat and had no patience for posturing, "Staff Sergeant Moskov has shown nothing but proper military courtesy throughout this conversation. You, on the other hand, have made increasingly inappropriate comments about her service in the service of other combat veterans. Perhaps it would be wise to reconsider your approach." The rebuke was delivered with the kind of quiet authority that should have ended arguments rather than escalating them. But Blackwood was too far committed to his course to recognize the lifeline being thrown to him. Instead of accepting Morrison's intervention gracefully, Blackwood made his most damaging mistake yet. His face twisted with indignation as he turned toward the general, his voice rising to a level that ensured his words would carry throughout the ballroom. "General Morrison, with all due respect, I don't need to be lectured about military courtesy by anyone. I've been serving this country since before most of these people were born, and I won't be intimidated by some combat engineer who thinks a few medals make her an expert on military strategy and policy." The dismissive reference to some combat engineer drew audible gasps from several directions as military personnel in the audience recognized the profound disrespect inherent in minimizing the service of an EOD specialist. The reaction from the crowd was immediate and unmistakable. Conversation stopped entirely as hundreds of people turned their full attention to the confrontation, many of them pulling out phones to record what was clearly becoming a significant incident. Several retired officers moved closer, their expressions showing a mixture of fascination and horror as they watched a senior naval officer systematically destroy his own reputation through sheer arrogance and stupidity. The ballroom's acoustics meant that Blackwood's words had carried to every corner of the space, ensuring that his dismissive comments about decorated combat veterans would be heard by everyone present, including several prominent journalists and political figures whose presence at the event guaranteed widespread coverage. The silence that followed Admiral Blackwood's outburst was deafening, broken only by the soft electronic sounds of dozens of phones recording what everyone present recognized as a career-defining moment. Alina stood perfectly still, her posture unchanged despite the Admiral's attempt at verbal intimidation, her expression showing neither fear nor anger but something far more dangerous, the complete professional assessment of a target that had just revealed itself to be entirely vulnerable. The contrast between her controlled demeanor and Blackwood's obvious emotional breakdown was stark enough that even civilian guests could recognize who held the real authority in this confrontation, regardless of the ranks displayed on their respective uniforms. When Alina finally spoke, Her voice carried the kind of calm authority that experienced soldiers associated with officers who had proven themselves under the worst possible conditions. Every word was carefully chosen and precisely delivered, her tone remaining respectful while simultaneously demonstrating that she was completely unimpressed by the Admiral's bluster and entirely confident in her ability to handle whatever escalation he might attempt. "Admiral Blackwood," she began, her use of his rank and name serving as a subtle reminder of the military courtesy he had abandoned. "I appreciate your passion for military effectiveness even if I disagree with your conclusions about women's capabilities in combat roles." She paused for a moment, allowing the tension in the room to build while her eyes never left his face, studying him with the kind of tactical assessment that combat veterans applied to potential threats. "However, I think there may be some confusion about the nature of this conversation," she continued, her voice carrying clearly across the hushed ballroom. "You've suggested that my service record represents luck rather than skill, training, and dedication. You've implied that my medals were somehow unearned or undeserved. These are serious accusations that reflect either a fundamental misunderstanding of how military decorations are awarded, or a deliberate attempt to minimize the sacrifices made by combat veterans for reasons I can't begin to fathom." The measured delivery of her words made them even more devastating than a shouted response would have been, as everyone present could recognize the profound restraint she was exercising in the face of what most would consider unforgivable insults. General Morrison nodded slightly in approval, recognizing the tactical brilliance of Alina's approach, while several other senior officers exchanged glances that suggested they were reevaluating their previous impressions of both participants in this confrontation. Admiral Blackwood, meanwhile, was beginning to realize that he had dramatically underestimated his opponent, but his pride prevented him from finding a graceful way to retreat from the position he had taken. "Since you seem to have strong opinions about the validity of combat decorations," Alina continued, her tone remaining conversational while her words cut like precision instruments, "perhaps you'd be willing to share the details of how you earned your own combat award. I notice several ribbons on your uniform that correspond to combat operations, and I'm sure everyone here would be interested to hear about the actions that earned you those decorations." Her eyes moved deliberately to his ribbon rack, studying the displayed awards with the kind of professional attention that made it clear she could identify every medal and understood exactly what each one represented in terms of actual service and sacrifice. The challenge was delivered with such perfect military courtesy that Blackwood couldn't object to it without appearing even more unreasonable. Yet everyone present understood that she was systematically dismantling his credibility with surgical precision. Several people in the crowd recognized the tactical brilliance of her approach, using his own claims about combat experience to expose the fundamental weakness in his position. The Admiral's face had progressed through several shades of red as he realized that every attempt to reassert his authority had only made his situation worse, but his ego prevented him from acknowledging the trap he had walked into. Furthermore, Alina continued, her voice taking on a slightly sharper edge while maintaining its professional tone, "Your comments about women creating distractions and causing casualties suggest either a remarkable ignorance of modern military operations or a willful disregard for documented evidence. Since you claim to base your conclusions on personal experience and factual analysis, I'm curious about the specific incidents that shaped your views. Can you provide details about the operations where women's presence resulted in mission failure or unnecessary casualties under your command?" The precision of her questions revealed the depth of her tactical thinking, as she systematically closed off every avenue of escape, while forcing Blackwood to either provide specific evidence for his claims, or admit that his opinions were based on prejudice rather than experience. The crowd had grown to include nearly half the ballroom's attendees, with many people abandoning their conversations to witness what had clearly become the evening's main event. Several prominent military and political figures were now openly watching the confrontation, their presence ensuring that whatever happened next would have consequences far beyond this single evening. Admiral Blackwood's response revealed the full extent of his miscalculation as he attempted to regain control through pure authoritarianism. "I don't have to justify 30 years of military service to anyone, especially not to some enlisted soldier who thinks combat experience makes her qualified to question the judgment of senior officers,"
he snapped, his voice shaking with indignation. The military works on a chain of command, and that chain doesn't include junior personnel lecturing their superiors about policy decisions they're not qualified to understand. His attempt to invoke military hierarchy was desperate and misguided, as everyone present could see that his authority was based solely on rank rather than competence or experience. Alina's smile was subtle but unmistakable, the expression of someone who had just been handed the perfect opportunity to deliver a decisive blow. "You're absolutely right about the importance of military hierarchy," said, her tone deceptively agreeable while her eyes remained fixed on his face with laser-like intensity. "Which is why I'm sure you won't mind if I share some information about your service record, since you've made it relevant to this discussion." She paused deliberately, allowing the implications of her words to sink in, while the crowd held its collective breath. "According to publicly available records," she continued, her voice carrying clearly across the now completely silent ballroom, "your entire 30-year career was spent in intelligence analysis and logistics coordination, with your overseas assignments consisting of staff positions at secure installations in Kuwait, Bahrain, and Germany. You've never held a combat command, never led troops in actual battle, and your closest approach to enemy fire was reading reports from people who actually did the fighting." The words hit their target with devastating accuracy, as everyone present realized that the Admiral's claims about combat experience had been completely fabricated. But Alina wasn't finished. "Your ribbon rack tells an interesting story for anyone who knows how to read it," she continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone conducting a professional briefing. "You have participation ribbons for campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan, but no decorations for valor or combat leadership. Your medals represent administrative achievements and length of service, which are certainly worthy of respect, but they don't qualify you to make authoritative statements about combat effectiveness or women's performance under fire." The systematic destruction of his credibility was methodical and complete, delivered with the kind of professional competence that made it impossible to dismiss or counterattack. Admiral Blackwood's face had progressed from red to purple as the full implications of Alina's words sank in. The carefully constructed image he had maintained for decades was crumbling in real time, broadcast to hundreds of witnesses who would carry this story far beyond the confines of this ballroom. His next words would prove to be the most damaging of the entire confrontation, as desperation drove him to make claims that could be easily verified and definitively disproven. "That's classified information," he stammered, his voice lacking the conviction that had characterized his earlier pronouncements. "My operational record includes missions that can't be discussed in public forums." The claim was so transparently false that several people in the crowd actually laughed, recognizing the classic refuge of someone caught in a lie. Alina's expression didn't change, but there was something in her eyes that suggested she had been waiting for exactly this kind of desperate deflection. "I understand your concern about operational security, Admiral," she said, her tone maintaining perfect professional courtesy while delivering another surgical strike. "However, participation in combat operations isn't classified information. The fact that an officer led troops in battle, commanded combat units, or earned decorations for valor are matters of public record that can be discussed without compromising security." She took a small step forward, her movement subtle but somehow managing to shift the entire dynamic of the confrontation. "Since you've spent this evening making definitive statements about combat effectiveness and women's performance under fire, I think it's reasonable for the people here to understand the experience for its conclusions. Are you claiming that your combat leadership experience is classified, or are you admitting that your opinions are based on something other than personal experience?" The question was phrased with devastating precision, offering Blackwood only two equally damaging options: either claim involvement in fictional classified operations, or admit that his authoritative pronouncements had no factual basis. The Admiral's desperation became increasingly apparent, as he realized that every response only made his situation worse. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he snapped, his composure completely shattered, as he pointed an accusatory finger directly at Alina. "I've forgotten more about military operations than you'll ever know. Just because some information isn't in your precious public records doesn't mean it didn't happen. There are operations that will never see the light of day. missions that required the kind of leadership and courage that today's military doesn't understand anymore. The claim was so outrageous that even his potential supporters in the crowd began to distance themselves physically, recognizing that the Admiral was now making statements that bordered on delusional. General Morrison stepped forward with an expression and Morrison stepped forward with disgust, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had actually led classified operations and understood the difference between legitimate security concerns and Stepford fabrication. Admiral Blackwood, she said coldly, claiming involvement in fictional classified operations is not just dishonest, it's potentially criminal. If you actually participated in operations that justify your claims about combat leadership, I'm sure you can provide at least general information about your command responsibilities without compromising security. But Blackwood was now too far committed to his fabrications to retreat gracefully. General Morrison, you of all people should understand that some sacrifices go unrecognized, he replied, his voice taking on a martyred tone that made several people in the audience visibly cringe. Not all of us had the luxury of serving in operations that generated favorable press coverage. Some of us served in the shadows, making the hard decisions that kept this country safe while others got the credit and the headlines. The implication that his service had been more significant than Morrison's actual combat leadership was so absurd that several officers in the crowd shook their heads in disbelief. Alina had remained silent during this exchange, but her expression suggested that she was cataloging every word for future reference. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a new quality that made everyone present understand that the final phase of this confrontation was about to begin. Admiral, I think there's been enough speculation about classified operations and shadow missions, she said, her tone taking on the crisp authority of someone delivering a briefing to superiors. Let me share some information that isn't classified, that can be verified by anyone with access to public records, and that directly relates to the claims you've made tonight. She reached into her small evening purse and withdrew a smartphone, her movements deliberate and confident as she accepted information that she had clearly prepared for exactly this moment. The Veterans Affairs Database, the Defense Manpower Data Center, and the Awards and Decorations Database are all publicly accessible, she continued, her voice carrying clearly across the now completely silent ballroom. They show exactly what
Power stated earlier. Your entire career consisted of intelligence analysis and logistics coordination positions at secure
installations. You never held a combat command, never led troops in battle, and never earned a single decoration for valor or combat leadership. The systematic presentation of verifiable facts hit the gathering like a series of precision strikes, each piece of information carefully chosen for maximum impact. Several people in the crowd were now openly using their phones to verify her claims, their expressions showing mounting confirmation of everything she had stated. Admiral Blackwood's face had gone pale as he realized that his decades of carefully maintained fiction were being destroyed by someone who had done her homework with military precision. Furthermore, Alina continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering an intelligence briefing, your claims about witnessing women's failures in combat are particularly interesting, given that women weren't officially assigned to combat roles during most of your career. The timeline of your service and the integration of women into combat positions makes your claimed observations physically impossible, unless you're suggesting that your classified shadow operations included time travel. The touch of dry humor in her final comment drew nervous laughter
from several directions as people recognized the complete absurdity
of the Admiral's position. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come. Alina's expression grew more serious as she prepared to deliver information that would transform this from a professional embarrassment into a potential criminal matter. There's one more thing that I think everyone here should know, she said, her voice dropping slightly while somehow managing to carry even more authority. 3 weeks ago I received a call from the Military Times asking me to comment on allegations that Admiral Blackwood had been claiming combat experience he never possessed in order to secure speaking engagements and consulting contracts with defense companies. Apparently several of his recent presentations to corporate clients include detailed accounts of combat operations that never occurred
and decorations he never earned.
The impact of this revelation was immediate and catastrophic. The ballroom erupted in whispered conversations as people realized they had just witnessed the exposure of what appeared to be systematic fraud, rather than simple exaggeration. Several board members of the foundation were now huddled in urgent conversation, clearly recognizing that their organization had been associated with someone whose credibility was now completely destroyed. The presence of journalists and political figures at the event guaranteed that this story would be national news within hours, with the added element of potential criminal fraud making it far more significant than a simple social confrontation. Admiral Blackwood's response revealed the full extent of his desperation as he realized that his career, reputation, and potentially his freedom were now at stake. "This is a coordinated attack," he declared, his voice shaking with a mixture of rage and fear. "This woman has been sent here to destroy me, but she has people who can't stand the fact that I've been telling the truth about military effectiveness. She's probably working with radical feminist groups or foreign agents who want to silence anyone who speaks out against the weakening of our armed forces." The paranoid accusations were so absurd that they only served to further damage his credibility that he was grasping at increasingly desperate explanations for his exposure.
The paranoid accusations that poured from Admiral Blackwood's mouth marked the complete disintegration of whatever dignity and authority he had possessed when the evening began. His wild claims about coordinated attacks and foreign agents drew looks of genuine concern from the crowd, as people began to worry about the mental state of someone who had held significant responsibility within the military establishment. Alina watched his breakdown with the detached professionalism of someone who had seen stress reactions under extreme circumstances, recognizing the signs of a person whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around them in real time. "Admiral," she said quietly, her voice cutting through his increasingly frantic accusations with the calm authority of someone completely in control of the situation. "I think you're embarrassing yourself and dishonoring the uniform you wear." The simple statement carried more weight than any elaborate response could have, as it spoke to the fundamental issue that everyone present could recognize, regardless of the specific details of his service record. His behavior tonight had been utterly unbecoming of a military officer, and had brought shame on the institution he claimed to represent. General Morrison stepped forward with an expression of disgust that had progressed beyond professional disapproval to personal revulsion. "Admiral Blackwood," she said, her voice carrying the kind of command authority that ended arguments rather than starting them, "I am personally going to ensure that every word you've spoken tonight is reported to the appropriate authorities. Your behavior has been a disgrace to the uniform, to the Navy, and to every veteran who has served with honor." Her words carried the weight of someone who had the connections and credibility to follow through on such threats, and everyone present understood that the Admiral's problems were about to extend far beyond this single evening. The Admiral's response revealed just how completely he had lost touch with reality, as the magnitude of his situation became clear. "You can't do this to me," he protested, his voice taking on a whining quality that contrasted sharply with his earlier authoritative tone. "I've given 30 years of my life to this country, I've sacrificed everything for my service, and this is how I'm repaid. By having some enlisted soldier destroy my reputation with lies and conspiracy theories." His attempt to portray himself as the victim was so transparently false that several people in the crowd actually laughed out loud, recognizing the complete reversal of reality his words represented. But Alina wasn't finished with her systematic dismantling of his credibility. "Admiral," she said, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a final briefing, "there's one more thing that I think everyone here should understand about the nature of military service and sacrifice." She paused deliberately, ensuring that she had the complete attention of everyone present before delivering what would prove to be the most powerful moment of the entire confrontation. "When you talk about women being a distraction in combat, when you claim that we freeze up under fire or can't handle the physical demands of military service, you're not just insulting me personally," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You're dishonoring the memory of every woman who has died in service to this country. You're spitting on the graves of my friends who gave their lives to protect soldiers like the ones you claim to care about so much." The emotional weight of her words hit the gathering like a physical blow, as everyone present understood that they were hearing from someone who had actually paid the price that the Admiral had only pretended to pay. Staff Sergeant Jessica Torres lost both legs defusing an IED that would have killed 8 male soldiers. Alina continued, her voice carrying across the completely silent ballroom with the force of absolute truth. Lieutenant Sarah Kim was killed by sniper fire while leading her platoon through a combat zone, saving the lives of 12 men under her command. Captain Maria Rodriguez died when she threw herself on a grenade to protect her squad, earning a posthumous Medal of Honor that her family received at her funeral. Each name was delivered with the precision of someone reading from a memorial wall, honoring fallen comrades while simultaneously destroying every argument the Admiral had made. The impact of these stories was devastating, not just to Blackwood's position but to everyone present who realized they were hearing about real sacrifice from someone who had witnessed it firsthand. Several people in the crowd were openly crying, moved by the stark contrast between genuine heroism and the Admiral's fabricated tales of glory. The difference between authentic service and self-serving fiction had never been more clearly illustrated, and everyone present understood that they had just witnessed something that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Admiral Blackwood's final response revealed the complete moral bankruptcy that had been hidden beneath his polished exterior for decades. "Those are just stories," he said dismissively, his voice shaking with desperation as he made one last attempt to salvage his position. "Anyone can make up heroic tales about dead soldiers who can't contradict them. I deal in facts and statistics, not emotional manipulation and propaganda designed to support political agendas." The callous dismissal of fallen heroes' sacrifices was so shocking that several people in the crowd gasped audibly, unable to believe that anyone could stoop to such depths of dishonor. The reaction from the crowd was immediate and overwhelming. Several veterans in the audience began moving toward the Admiral with expressions that suggested they were no longer interested in maintaining the polite fiction of a charity event. General Morrison stepped directly in front of Blackwood, her face showing a level of anger that made it clear she was exercising tremendous restraint in not physically confronting him. "Get out," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "Get out of this event, get out of this hotel, and if you have any sense left, get out of this city before these people decide to show you what real military justice looks like." Alina remained perfectly composed throughout the Admiral's final breakdown, her expression showing neither satisfaction nor anger but rather the professional assessment of someone who had accomplished a mission with precision and thoroughness. When she spoke for the final time, her words carried the weight of absolute moral authority that comes only from genuine service and sacrifice. "Admiral Blackwood," she said quietly, her voice somehow carrying clearly across the hushed ballroom, 30 years ago, you took an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. Tonight you've dishonored that oath, insulted the memory of fallen heroes, and brought shame on every real veteran in this room. I hope someday you find the courage to understand what service actually means, but until then, you have no right to wear that uniform or claim the title of officer." The finality of her words marked the end of Admiral Harrison Blackwood's career, reputation and standing in the military community. As security personnel appeared to escort him from the premises, the man who had entered the ballroom as a respected senior officer, left as a cautionary tale about the dangers of ego, prejudice, and the fundamental dishonesty that comes from claiming honor that was never earned. The silence that followed Admiral Blackwood's humiliating exit stretched for nearly a full minute as 500 guests processed what they had just witnessed. The transformation of a routine charity gala into the public destruction of a senior military officer's career was unprecedented in most people's experience, and the implications of what had been revealed were still sinking in throughout the ballroom. Phones continued recording as people documented the immediate aftermath, recognizing that they had been present for a moment that would be studied and discussed for years to come in military circles and beyond. General Morrison was the first to break the silence, her voice carrying the authority of someone taking command of a crisis situation. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her words carrying clearly across the hushed gathering, "I want to personally apologize on behalf of the Heroes Foundation for what you have just witnessed. Admiral Blackwood's behavior tonight was completely unacceptable and does not represent the values of this organization or the military community we serve. Her statement was delivered with the kind of crisp professionalism that helped restore some sense of order to what had become a chaotic situation. However, Morrison continued, her tone shifting to something warmer and more appreciative. I also want to thank Staff Sergeant Moskov for her service, her courage, and her willingness to speak truth to power when it mattered most. What you witnessed tonight was not just the exposure of one individual's dishonesty, but a demonstration of the values that actually define military service: integrity, honor, and the courage to stand up for what's right, regardless of the personal cost. The spontaneous applause that erupted from the crowd was thunderous and sustained, as people expressed their appreciation for both Alina's service and her handling of an impossible situation. As the applause continued, Alina found herself surrounded by veterans, active duty personnel, and civilian supporters who wanted to express their admiration for her composure and courage. The conversations that developed around her revealed the broader impact of what had just occurred, as people shared their own experiences with officers who had exaggerated their service records or made dismissive comments about women in the military. What had begun as a single confrontation had become a catalyst for broader discussions about authenticity, respect, and the true meaning of military service. Among the most interesting conversations were those involving defense contractors and military suppliers, who had apparently paid significant fees for Admiral Blackwood's consulting services based on his claimed combat experience. Several representatives of major corporations were now huddled in urgent discussions with their legal teams, recognizing that they might have been victims of fraud that could expose them to significant financial and reputational damage. The revelation that Blackwood had been monetizing fabricated military credentials added a criminal dimension to what might otherwise have been seen as simply a social embarrassment. The journalists present at the event were already filing stories that would dominate military and political news cycles for days to come. The combination of a senior officer's public humiliation, allegations of fraud, and the dramatic contrast between fabricated and authentic military service created a narrative that resonated far beyond the immediate military community. Within hours, video clips of the confrontation were spreading across social media platforms, with particular attention focused on Alina's calm professionalism in the face of increasingly desperate attacks on her credibility and service. But perhaps the most significant aftermath was the conversation that developed among the veterans present about the broader issues that the confrontation had highlighted. The willingness of someone in Blackwood's position to make authoritative statements about combat effectiveness without any actual combat experience spoke to larger problems within military bureaucracy and the defense establishment. The ease with which he had apparently deceived corporate clients and professional organizations suggested systemic failures in verification and accountability that extended far beyond one individual's dishonesty. As the evening progressed and the formal program resumed, the Foundation's leadership made the decision to address the incident directly rather than attempting to minimize or ignore what had occurred. The president of the board took the stage to deliver remarks that acknowledged the uncomfortable realities that had been exposed while reaffirming the organization's commitment to supporting authentic veterans and their families. The decision to confront the issue head-on rather than deflecting or covering up demonstrated the kind of institutional integrity that helped restore confidence in the Foundation's mission and leadership. The investigation that would follow in the coming weeks would reveal the full scope of Admiral Blackwood's deception, including fabricated claims in official biographies, false statements in security clearance applications, and fraudulent representations to corporate clients that had netted him hundreds of thousands of dollars in consulting fees. The criminal charges that eventually resulted from these revelations would make the confrontation at the charity gala seem like merely the opening act of a much larger drama about integrity, accountability, and justice in military institutions. For Alina, the evening's events represented both vindication and burden, as she found herself thrust into a spotlight she had never sought or wanted. The requests for interviews, speaking engagements and media appearances that followed would force her to grapple with questions about her own role in exposing systematic problems within military culture.
Her decision to handle these opportunities with the same measured professionalism she had demonstrated during the confrontation would ultimately establish her as a powerful voice for authentic military service and veteran advocacy. The long-term impact of that evening would extend far beyond the immediate participants, as military institutions were forced to examine their own verification procedures and accountability measures. The ease with which Blackwood had maintained his fabricated narrative for decades highlighted systemic weaknesses that required comprehensive reform rather than individual punishment. The conversation that began with one woman's refusal to accept disrespect would ultimately contribute to broader changes in how military service was documented, verified, and honored throughout the defense establishment. Within 72 hours of the confrontation at the Marina Bay Resort, Admiral Harrison Blackwood's world began collapsing with the methodical precision of a controlled demolition. The video recordings from the charity gala had gone viral across military social media networks, generating millions of views and sparking intense discussions about integrity and military leadership. More importantly, the public nature of his humiliation had prompted multiple institutions to begin reviewing their relationships with him, leading to discoveries that transformed what had initially appeared to be simple exaggeration into evidence of systematic fraud spanning nearly 2 decades. The Military Times investigation that Alina had referenced during the confrontation proved to be just the beginning of a comprehensive examination of Blackwood's claims and activities. Investigative journalists working with veteran fact-checkers began systematically reviewing every public statement he had made about his military service, every biography he had submitted to speaking bureaus, and every consultation agreement he had signed with defense contractors. The pattern that emerged was damning in its consistency. Virtually every claim about combat experience, operational leadership, or battlefield heroics was either completely fabricated or grossly exaggerated beyond any connection to reality. The Defense Criminal Investigative Service launched a formal investigation within a week of the incident, focusing initially on potential violations of federal fraud statutes related to his consulting contracts. The discovery that Blackwood had collected over $800,000 in fees from major defense contractors based on fabricated credentials elevated the case from simple misconduct to serious federal crimes carrying potential prison sentences. Corporate executives who had paid premium rates for his supposed battlefield expertise found themselves explaining to shareholders and legal teams how they had failed to verify the basic qualifications of someone they had trusted with sensitive strategic planning. But the most devastating revelations came from the military personnel records that investigators accessed through official channels. The detailed documentation of Blackwood's actual assignments, performance evaluations, and award citations painted a picture of mediocrity and political maneuvering that stood in stark contrast to the heroic narrative he had constructed for public consumption. His fitness reports consistently rated him as adequate but unremarkable, with supervisors noting his tendency towards self-promotion and his difficulty accepting criticism or acknowledging mistakes. The investigation also revealed that multiple people within military intelligence circles had suspected Blackwood's claims for years but had been reluctant to challenge a senior officer without definitive proof. The informal networks through which accurate information typically circulated had been aware of discrepancies in his story, but the combination of military hierarchy and professional courtesy had prevented anyone from confronting him directly. Alina's willingness to challenge him publicly had provided the catalyst that allowed others to come forward with their own observations and concerns. Among the most damaging discoveries were email communications between Blackwood and corporate clients that showed him deliberately embellishing his military background to justify higher consulting fees. Messages retrieved from company servers revealed detailed negotiations where he had claimed specific combat leadership experience that personnel records proved he had never possessed. The premeditated nature of these deceptions elevated them from simple bragging to calculated fraud designed to obtain money under false pretenses. The ripple effects of the investigation extended far beyond Blackwood himself, as military institutions were forced to examine their own verification procedures and accountability measures. The Pentagon announced new protocols for validating claims made by retired officers in their post-military career, Recognizing that the honor system that had previously governed such matters was insufficient to prevent systematic deception, the changes included requirements for official to claim specific records before officers could claim specific combat experience in public forums or professional settings. Defense contractors found themselves implementing new due diligence procedures for consulting agreements, recognizing that their previous reliance on rank and reputation had left them vulnerable to exactly the kind of fraud that Blackwood had perpetrated. The financial losses from contracts based on false credentials prompted industry-wide changes in how military expertise was verified and validated, with some companies facing shareholder lawsuits for their failure to properly vet high-paid consultants. The investigation also brought increased attention to the broader issue of stolen valor and military impersonation, with veterans organizations using Blackwood's case as an example of why stronger enforcement mechanisms were needed. The contrast between his fabricated heroics and Alina's authentic service highlighted the offensive nature of false claims about military service, particularly when those claims were used to diminish or dismiss the contributions of actual combat veterans. As federal prosecutors prepared a case against Blackwood, the investigation expanded to include potential tax fraud related to income he had obtained through false representations. The Internal Revenue Service began examining whether his consulting fees constituted fraudulently obtained income that should be subject to additional penalties and restitution requirements. The complex web of legal and financial consequences that grew out of a single evening's confrontation demonstrated how deeply his deceptions had penetrated various aspects of his post-military career. The psychological evaluation that was ordered as investigation provided insights into the mindset that had enabled such systematic deception over such an extended period. Mental health professionals who examined Blackwood identified patterns of narcissistic behavior and grandiose self-perception that had apparently led him to begin believing his own fabrications. The clinical assessment suggested that what might have begun as minor had evolved into elaborate fantasies that he had come to accept as reality, making his eventual confrontation with actual facts all the more devastating to his psychological stability. 6 months after the confrontation that destroyed his career, former Admiral Harrison Blackwood stood in a federal courtroom wearing civilian clothes and facing the consequences of decades of deception. The man who had once commanded respect through manufactured authority now appeared diminished and defeated, his carefully constructed persona replaced by the reality of someone whose entire professional identity had been built on lies. The federal judge who would sentence him had spent weeks reviewing evidence that painted a comprehensive picture of fraud, theft, and dishonor that extended far beyond simple exaggeration into criminal territory that demanded accountability. The prosecution's case had been overwhelming in its thoroughness, presenting evidence of 19 separate instances of fraud involving defense contractors, and professional organizations that had paid premium rates for Blackwood's supposed expertise. The total amount of money he had obtained through false representations exceeded $1.2 million, transforming what might have been a misdemeanor offense into felony charges carrying significant prison time. More importantly, the systematic nature of his deceptions over nearly 2 decades demonstrated a pattern of calculated criminality, rather than simple mistakes or momentary lapses in judgment. Alina had been asked to provide a victim impact statement, though she initially questioned whether she personally had been harmed by Blackwood's actions. However, prosecutors and veterans advocates helped her understand that his dismissive comments about female combat veterans, his minimization of their sacrifices, and his fraudulent claims about his own service had indeed caused harm to the broader military community and the families of those who had made ultimate sacrifices. Her statement to the court was delivered with the same measured professionalism that had characterized her confrontation with Blackwood, but the emotional weight of her words about fallen comrades gave them devastating impact. "Your Honor," she had said, standing before the judge with military bearing that contrasted sharply with Blackwood's defeated posture,
the defendant's actions represent more than simple fraud or theft.
His willingness to fabricate combat experience while simultaneously dismissing the real sacrifices of others strikes at the heart of
Military honor and the trust that binds service members together.
When someone claims credentials they never earned while diminishing the contributions of those who actually paid the price, they damage not just their own integrity but the entire institution they claim to represent. The defense attorneys
had attempted to portray Blackwood as someone who had simply gotten carried away with storytelling, arguing that his decades of legitimate administrative service should mitigate the severity of his punishment.
However, their arguments were undermined by evidence showing
the premeditated and calculating nature of his deceptions, including written proposals to corporate clients that contained specific false claims designed to justify higher consulting fees.
The judge's response made clear that the court viewed his actions as a betrayal of military
values rather than simple civilian fraud.
Blackwood, the judge had said during sentencing using his civilian title deliberately, your actions represent a particularly
egregious form of fraud because they exploit the respect and trust that society places in military service.
You took the
honor earned by others through genuine sacrifice and used it for personal profit while simultaneously dishonoring their memory through false claims about your own service.
The sentence I impose today reflects not just the financial harm you caused but the damage you inflicted on military institutions and the families of those who served with authentic courage. The sentence of 4 years in federal prison followed by 3 years of supervised release and full restitution to his victims sent a clear message throughout
military and veteran communities about the consequences of stolen valor fraud.
The additional requirement that he perform 2,000 hours of community service with veteran organizations
was designed to expose him to the reality of genuine military service and sacrifice that he had spent decades exploiting for personal gain.
The judge's decision to make his case a matter of public record ensured that
his name would be permanently associated with military fraud and dishonor.
The broader impact of Blackwood's prosecution extended far beyond
his individual punishment, as military institutions and defense contractors implemented comprehensive reforms designed to prevent similar fraud in the future.
The Pentagon established new verification requirements for retired officers seeking to monetize their
military experience, while professional organizations began requiring documented proof of claimed credentials rather than relying on honor systems that had proven vulnerable to systematic deception.
These changes represented a fundamental shift toward accountability and verification that many argued should have been implemented decades earlier. For Alina, the resolution of
Blackwood's case marked the end of an unwanted chapter in her life, but also the beginning of new opportunities to advocate for authentic military service and veteran rights.
The national attention generated by her confrontation with Blackwood had established her
as a powerful voice for combat veterans, leading to speaking engagements, consulting opportunities and advocacy positions that allowed her to channel her experience toward positive change.
Her decision to use this platform responsibly, focusing on substantive issues rather than personal celebrity,
earned respect throughout military and political circles.
The educational value of Blackwood's case extended throughout
military academies, leadership schools and professional development programs, where his story became a cautionary tale about the importance of integrity, authenticity and moral courage.
The contrast between his fabricated heroics and Alina's genuine service provided a clear illustration of the difference between real military values and their counterfeit imitations. Students and officers who studied the case came away with a deeper understanding of why
military honor codes existed and what happened when they were violated.
The final chapter of this story was written not in courthouse records or news articles but in the quiet conversations that took place
throughout military communities as people reflected on the importance of calling out dishonesty regardless of rank or social position.
Alina's willingness to challenge Blackwood's
claims, despite the potential personal and professional risks, demonstrated the kind of moral courage that military institutions claim to value but didn't always reward in practice. Her example inspired others to speak up when they encountered similar situations, contributing to a cultural shift toward greater accountability and authenticity that honored the genuine sacrifices of those who had served with distinction.
The message that emerged from this entire incident was simple but profound.
Military honor cannot be claimed, only earned, and those who attempt to profit from borrowed glory will ultimately face the consequences of their deception.
The contrast between authentic service and military hers had never been more clearly illustrated, providing a lasting lesson about
The importance of integrity, courage, and the willingness to defend truth regardless of the personal cost involved.
Up next,